We're going to get started in just a moment here. So I want to welcome everyone to our Cannabis Legalization Panel Forum, Economic Impact. Give us just a few moments to get started. In the meantime, Delaware CAN VP and Director of Operations, John Seibert, will be adding the link for our publications that are on our website as a virtual lit display, as well as some other additional links throughout tonight's program. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Cannabis Legalization Panel Forum, Economic Impact. My name is Zoe Patchell, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. We appreciate everyone for joining us for tonight's presentation. As you may already know, today was a very exciting, historic day in Delaware. The long-awaited third version of an adult use cannabis legalization bill was finally introduced in the House of Representatives today. Tonight's forum was pre-scheduled before we knew the bill would be introduced today, so we did not allow time to go over the bill details in depth tonight. However, we will be scheduling an information session via Zoom for sometime next week where we'll be going over all the details and answering any questions that you might have about the new legislation. In the meantime, you can check out our highlights of the bill in an earlier Facebook post if you scroll down our page to the breaking news post. And we're really excited about HB 150. It's a huge and much needed first step in the right direction. We're particularly excited about some of the great new changes in this version, especially the expansion of the expungement provision, as well as the new social equity and micro licenses that will be available to ensure that people and communities that have been impacted most by cannabis prohibition have a chance to compete in the legal industry. The bill also legalizes several current illegal acts and civil asset forfeiture for cannabis possession offenses, and establishes robust consumer safety protections, and so much more. So join us next week for our HB 150 information session and look for further posts for more information on that legislation. And in the meantime, we really encourage everyone to contact their state representative and senator and ask them to vote yes on HB 150. You can find out how to take action on our website at delawarecannabis.org, as well as on Facebook. So our program tonight is brought to you by the Delaware Cannabis Policy Coalition, which includes Delaware CAN, the Marijuana Policy Project, Delaware NORML, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. Tonight's presentation is a part of an ongoing series of virtual forums that we're organizing to raise awareness about the harms of cannabis prohibition, debunk information disseminated by opponents, and discuss the many social and economic benefits of cannabis legalization. Tonight, we'll be discussing the financial cost of cannabis prohibition and the total economic impact of cannabis legalization. While there are so many reasons to legalize cannabis, the economic benefits often seem to get the most interest. However, there's still such a great deal of misinformation about this particular topic, and the discussion regarding the current cost of cannabis prohibition tends to get overlooked in these narratives. Cannabis prohibition is a failed, costly policy, and despite over 60% of Delawareans in support of cannabis legalization, taxpayers are continually left footing the expensive bill for this ineffective policy year after year. Research shows that cannabis prohibition does not reduce the use, supply, or demand of cannabis. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration data shows a very large pre-existing consumer base in our state, with 18.5%, or approximately 145,000 Delaware adults admitting to consuming cannabis, according to their 2019 report. While Delaware passed decriminalization in 2015, research from the Delaware Statistical Analysis Center shows a staggering 127% increase in possession-only offenses since then, with over 500 consumers a month on average having some sort of law enforcement interaction for a cannabis possession-only offense. And this doesn't even include felony cannabis charges. Millions of taxpayers' dollars are wasted every year on the enforcement of these possession-only offenses, which make up 52% of all the drug offenses in our state, according to data from the Statistical Analysis Center. In addition to the enforcement and prosecution costs, there's also significant costs of collateral consequences created by cannabis prohibition, which also typically get overlooked in the calculations of the total cost of this disastrous policy. Because cannabis prohibition doesn't reduce the use, supply, or demand of cannabis, The rather large pre-existing consumer base creates a considerable demand for cannabis, which bolsters a large, thriving, pre-existing multi-million-dollar illicit market in the first state that rivals some of Delaware's largest legal markets. While there is no data to determine exactly how large the current illicit market is, we can look to recent projections of the size of Delaware's legal market to give you an idea of how huge that market currently is. However, because of the policy of cannabis prohibition, this multi-million-dollar market exists in Delaware completely on the illicit market, which causes a host of collateral consequences that also comes with a significant cost to the taxpayers. So not only do taxpayers pay for law enforcement interaction, arrests, court costs, and prosecution for otherwise law-abiding consumers, but they also end up paying for the collateral consequences that are a direct result of cannabis prohibition, just like history shows with alcohol prohibition. Cannabis prohibition comes with a substantial human and economic cost, and it's a liability to our state, to our communities, and to the taxpayers. Meanwhile, our neighbors in New Jersey and 14 other states have repealed their antiquated policy and turned their costly liability into a lucrative asset for their state. Nearly a decade of research from the first states to legalize shows significant economic development and revenue generation that far exceed conservative pre-legalization estimates simply by converting the already existing profitable illicit cannabis market into a safe, legal, taxed, and regulated industry. With a significant increase in revenue generated just over the last year, the cannabis industry has proven to be essentially recession-proof as sales have skyrocketed during the pandemic. The typical idea of the economic benefit of legalization usually focuses almost exclusively on the taxes and licensing fees, but does not take into consideration the property taxes and employment income tax that would be generated by legalization, nor does it factor in the many ancillary industries that greatly benefit from the secondary impact of cannabis legalization. The new adult use legalization bill, HB 150, will create economic development, agricultural growth, sustainable tax revenue, many small businesses, and thousands of well-paying employment opportunities for Delaware, while saving the taxpayers millions in enforcement expenditures by ending unnecessary arrests for conduct that is now legal in 14 states and our nation's capital. Simply put, cannabis legalization will greatly benefit the entire economic health of Delaware and many local small businesses by growing and stimulating Delaware's economy while keeping Delaware competitive with other mid-Atlantic states. 19 other states have pending legislation to legalize cannabis this year, and it's imperative that the first state does not get left behind in this emerging industry. So without further ado, we're excited to bring to you our amazing lineup of policy and industry experts and a very special guest speaker to discuss the details regarding the cost of cannabis prohibition and the economic benefits of cannabis legalization. Before we introduce our panelists, we're very grateful to have a very special guest speaker tonight, Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGuiness, who recently released an independent special report from her office that details the economic benefits of cannabis legalization. State Auditor Kathy McGuiness was elected Auditor of Accounts in November 2018. When sworn into office, she became the first female Auditor of Accounts in Delaware history. Born in Kent County and raised in Sussex County, where she lives today with her husband and 3 children, Kathleen graduated from Cape Penelope High School in Lewis and earned a bachelor's degree in biology and pharmacy. For 16 years, Kathleen owned and operated 2 businesses in Rehoboth Beach, where she became an advocate for the revitalization of downtown, spurring its growth for a summer community to a year-round destination for tourists and full-time home for thousands. Until her swearing in as an Auditor of Accounts, Kathleen served almost 2 decades as an elected Rehoboth Beach commissioner. Finding unnecessary and wasteful spending spurred her interest in an eventual run for Delaware Auditors of Accounts. As Auditor of Accounts, Auditor Kathleen McGuiness, a certified fraud examiner, is responsible for Title 29 of Delaware Code for the auditing and reporting funds raised and spent by Delaware annually. Please welcome Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGuiness.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with you all again. So thank you for the background. For those of you who do not know about my office. What we do is we ensure accountability of taxpayer dollars, and we want to combat fraud, waste, and abuse at the same time. We do various amounts of independent engagements, investigations, performance audits, financial audits, special reports, just to name a few. So we want to make sure there's statutory compliance, and we also evaluate economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in state government. So with that being said, and one of the things which is well within our wheelhouse or our realm is Title 2909 of the code, and it speaks to special reports. And many people are familiar with the office with the big report we do every year, which we just put out, the fire report, and showed that having volunteer fire service, for example, saves the state about $244 million a year. Well, we did a special report. This one was titled Millions in Revenue Anticipated from Legalizing Marijuana in Delaware. We presented this to the General Assembly. The ball's in their court. We did hear some news today in regards to legislation. Our report, and we believe our methodology is sound, speaks to a potential market of $215 million, a potential state revenue annually of $43 million, and we believe that's conservative. Also using the tax rate of 20%. Again, that's just the rate that we used. This is up to the legislators to choose what they would like to do. And we believe in 5 years, 1,400 to 2,400 jobs. As you all know, we are not the minority. Over 60% of Delawareans are in favor of adult recreation or adult use. Over 21, they support this legalization. And at the end of the day, it's just my job to run the numbers and give the legislators this information. We believe we've given them more than they've had in the past. And it's for them to weigh in what's best for the first state. Again, I want to speak that we did give a conservative estimate. And there's new data available showing that there's probably a higher percentage of Delawareans that would admit to using marijuana. So with that being said, we know the change with society's attitude. We think that regulating the sale of marijuana would generate not only the money, but it would also help get this off the illicit market. Again, our report focuses on the economic implications of legalization. Such a move would be a positive step forward also in reforming criminal justice system. But again, choosing to allow the sale of marijuana on the black market and go unregulated means that Delaware will be left behind. As mentioned earlier by Zoe, other states are realizing this important economic, public health, and social equity advantage that legalization provides. So we are hopeful that Delaware the first state will not be last in the region to legalize marijuana. If you would like to read a report, please go to auditor.delaware.gov. And on the top bar, you can click on reports and it pops up probably towards the top of the page. It's very informative. Again, we stand by our methodology. We believe that no Delaware taxpayer wants to see cuts in services or a door closed on economic growth opportunities. And this is something that can create jobs. We believe it could be positive. We also know from research from those who have legalized it that you have a decrease in opioid use. So there are many positives, but there are many, many myths out there as well. And I think there needs to be a campaign about safety, kind of like we marketed the campaign years ago here in the States against Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and that has worked very well. It's done some of its job. There's always more to do, but there could be a similar campaign here in regards to the safety and usage, et cetera, around the whole framework of legalization of marijuana. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy. Our timing of our report was coincidental, so we're very excited that it's been used as many as a backup data and sounding board for this entire effort that seems to be moving forward in the General Assembly.
Yes, thank you so much, Auditor McGuiness, for being a part of our forums, and thank you so much for the special report. We really appreciate you providing your fiscal perspective on this topic and publishing this thoughtful review regarding the benefits of legalization in Delaware. And actually, John Seibert has dropped the report in the comment section of this forum. So if you want to check that out, you can find it in the comment section there. Thank you again, Auditor McGuiness. We really appreciate you being a part of this.
Thank you so much for having me.
So our first panelist this evening will be Delaware CAN's own co-founder and director, attorney Adam Windett. Adam Windett, a Delaware native, is an attorney, owner, and managing partner of Hopkins & Windett in Dover, focusing his practice on criminal defense. He is a member of the National Association of the Criminal Defense Lawyers and the NORML Legal Committee. In 2015, 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020, Adam was named a top 10 under 40 criminal defense attorney by the National Academy of Criminal Defense Attorneys. Adam regularly successfully litigates cannabis cases in a courtroom here in Delaware, and in 2016, he successfully litigated a case on behalf of a medical cannabis holder, resulting in a decision by the Delaware Supreme Court that the cardholder was permitted to use medical cannabis while on probation, and that his probation could not be violated for use of medical cannabis. Adam began working with Cannabis Bureau of Delaware in 2016 and assisted in the founding of our very own Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. He now serves as Delaware CAN's treasurer and sits on the board of directors. Please help me welcome attorney Adam Windett.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for having me. So the cannabis legalization debate follows some basic economic principles. It's a cost-benefit analysis, weighing of the pro and cons of alternative policy positions. And there's a lot of talk about the benefits of legalization, far too often, I think, focusing on the tax revenue that can be derived from it. There is some conversation about the cost, and most of those cost conversations focused on the fiscal cost of cannabis prohibition, mostly the enforcement cost, the criminal justice expenses associated with enforcement. And there have been studies that have tried to quantify that amount. I know people like hard numbers and how many dollars does it cost. Pre-decriminalization, the ACLU estimated that Delaware was spending approximately $13 million enforcing possession-only offenses. There haven't been any studies since then to estimate the cost specific to Delaware, but in my experience in the criminal justice world, it seems that the costs have not changed so much, and there's reasons why. Cultivation, manufacture, selling cannabis, the law is still the same. Those costs are still the same. Arguably, they're higher because consumption rates are up. There's more sales, there's more opportunities for police contact, and the police are still investigating cannabis-only cases. They're not focusing on opiates or hard drugs. They're doing cannabis-specific investigations, and I see these cases in my practice regularly. On the other side of the fiscal cost equation, there's not much of a reduction in cost enforcing decrim. Much of the process is still the same. Most of these cases start with traffic stops. The cost of employing officers has only gone up. So the stops are much the same, the process is much the same, and therefore the costs are much the same. And I think what's important in this regard is the cost of effectuating a traffic stop, of searching a vehicle, detaining people in the vehicle, processing, bagging evidence, and logging that in back at the station and doing the necessary paperwork. That process is the same as it was before, and the cost is the same as it was before. And the cost of doing that is actually greater than the revenue that can be brought in with the fines and costs associated with even decrim offenses, because it costs about $65 an hour in most jurisdictions in Delaware, just for an officer's time. When you add up all of the cost of employing an officer, these stops involve more than one officer. So by the time the citation is written, the state has already spent more money than it can expect to get back on these possession-only offenses. Typically, misdemeanors are just fines as well, and they're more costly than the civil violation, because what the state really relies on in this system is for people to accept responsibility early, to not go to court, to not challenge these things, because if they do, the process is the same exact process as it was before, with the exception civil offenses are tried by magistrates and misdemeanors for possession are tried by juries in the court of common pleas. Courts in Delaware have held that the testing still has to be done. The cost of the gas chromatograph and the mass spectrometer testing is significant. It involves the consumables of the test, the columns and vials and gas that they use to do the test, and also the labor. And I said that the state really relies on people to accept responsibility to keep the cost down, because even with a civil violation, you have a right to a hearing. And I encourage everyone to make the state prove it, because if you're charged with a civil violation only, you really can't lose if, the offer is plead to the civil violation and pay the fine. And if people challenge these offenses, it just mounts more cost of court cost of prosecution. It takes police officers off the road who have to then come to court and prosecute these cases. So when we look at the fiscal cost, the things that can be measured with regard to cannabis prohibition and enforcement, the costs are much the same. They far exceed the revenue that can come in on these offenses. On selling on other felony offenses, that's a much larger investment than possession cases. And those costs are all the same, while consumption rates continue to rise and the policy's having no measurable effect if it's intended to be a deterrent. So it really begs the question of why the state of Delaware is throwing money away to enforce decriminalization. But the fiscal cost is just part of the equation. And my position is it's the small part of the equation when you talk about cost. When we talk about economics, costs are not just things that can be measured in dollars. There's opportunity cost. There's other implications of prohibition. And that's where prohibition really gets costly, because the human cost far exceeds the fiscal cost of enforcement. And when studies are done about the cost of cannabis prohibition, the studies typically don't focus on what are the human costs and what are the opportunity costs of prohibition. Police interactions, civil citations, and particularly arrests and felony convictions can have a lifelong impact on people. And how that plays out in economic terms, our economy is not as productive as it could be. There's people who are being excluded from employment by virtue of a criminal conviction who could be a more productive worker than the person who gets the job, most of the time by virtue of being the best candidate without a criminal history. There's people out there who would make a better plumber or a better electrician, but they can't even participate in those markets because they can't get a license due to a conviction. So what we see in the economic impact is that, it makes the economy less efficient. We're excluding people from markets later. But then there's perhaps an even bigger cost than that, when we consider the other human impacts. And these are things that are not so easy to talk about, and especially when we talk about things in economic terms. But the reality is there's a massive economic cost in the lives that are literally lost at the hands of prohibition. It's one of the main economic costs that doesn't really get talked about enough. When someone loses their life, the value of a single human life is greater than what Delaware was spending on enforcement cost on possession only offenses. When people are sent to jail and incarcerated for participating in this market, their loss of time, those free years, that has a value that can't be recovered. The impact on their families has a value. So those are the hidden costs. And it's hard to reduce those things down to dollars. I know economists can, and insurance companies can, and the government can, reduce the value of a year of someone's life or their entire life down to a dollar amount. And these are massive costs of prohibition, far exceeding those costs. And in addition to that, when we talk about a cost benefit analysis, and one of the costs we have to consider with prohibition is the opportunity cost. And it factors in with the human cost because cannabis prohibition disproportionately affects people of color and people of lower socioeconomic status. Police officers target these neighborhoods, they over-enforce these neighborhoods, and we get these disproportionate results in the criminal justice system. It breeds distrust in communities. There's an opportunity cost in taking this course of action. One, if you're pulling people over and stopping them and searching them and arresting them and going to court for cannabis offenses, or you're spending months-long investigation to, arrest a nonviolent cannabis seller who's unarmed, who has done nothing violent in his life, but simply sells cannabis. Every hour the police spend enforcing those statutes, they're not enforcing crimes or investigating cases with real victims. They're taking resources and putting it in to enforcement of prohibition that could be placed elsewhere. And the distrust that they're breeding in communities are further hindering their abilities to prosecute these more serious crimes. So when we talk about the cost of prohibition, I would suggest that we consider an expansive view of all the costs and not just the fiscal cost, the things that can be measured by dollars. And I know there's probably not going to be a study on that, and everybody's going to weigh these factors differently. But when we talk to people and when we advocate for cannabis legalization and talk to our public officials, there has to be a consideration of all the costs, not just those enforcement costs, but the human cost. Now, just to close out, I want to make one last statement because I was asked to talk a little bit about Delaware before I close this out. We have some national experts on to follow me. When we consider this cost benefit analysis, when we consider legalization, I would suggest that we consider things more broadly. Legalization is creating interstate markets only because of federal prohibition. The end of prohibition federally is going to allow markets to operate interstate. And not every state's going to be producing a pro rata share of cannabis in this interstate model when we get to that point. So legalization is coming to Delaware. It's coming everywhere soon. And when states legalize, we have to be forward looking. I think Delaware is doing that with their bill with low barriers to entry, low application fees, and a low tax. Because the key when we create this market is to look to the future and know that this is eventually going to be a national market, that Delaware is going to have a competitive advantage by getting in early, and that we have factors in play here in Delaware that could position us to be leaders in this market, to be a net exporter of cannabis to other states. We have close proximity to large population centers on the East Coast, access to interstate highways and ports. We have agricultural heritage here in Delaware and expertise. I think we're second in the nation in terms of agricultural output per acre, only behind California. We produce a disproportionate portion of the country's broiler chickens and lima beans and other agricultural products. So when we look at legalization in Delaware, we should be looking at this big picture, creating a market that's going to be competitive nationally and taking advantage of Delaware's agricultural history, our climate, and other factors that could lead us to produce a disproportionate share of the country's cannabis. So those are my Delaware specific comments that I needed to get in there to continue to build on our agricultural background and those other advantages we have over other states to produce not just our own cannabis, but cannabis for everybody across the country. And thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak here tonight.
Thank you so much, Attorney Adam Windett. We're so grateful for all the research that you've done on this topic, as well as all the work that you do here in Delaware and the many roles that you fulfill within our own organization, Delaware CAN. Thank you for joining us tonight, Adam.
Thank you, Zoe.
Next up, we have Karen O'Keefe, who is the Director of State Policies at the Marijuana Policy Project. Karen is MPP's Director of State Policies. She manages MPP's grassroots and direct lobbying efforts in most state legislatures. Karen played a significant role in MPP's successful medical marijuana campaigns in Montana, Rhode Island, and has managed MPP's state legislative department during the campaigns that resulted in Vermont and Illinois becoming the first two states to legislatively legalize cannabis. Medical marijuana victories in Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania, and successful decriminalization campaigns here in Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. In 2011, she was appointed by Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley to serve on the state's medical marijuana working group. Karen is admitted to the bar in the District of Columbia and lives in West Hollywood, California, where she is appointed member of the city's Rent Stabilization Commission. Please welcome Karen O'Keefe.
Thank you, Zoe. Good evening. At the outset, I wanted to say how very lucky Delaware is and everybody in the state who supports sensible cannabis policies to have Zoe as one of its residents, along with the dedicated team of activists at Delaware CAN. They are really amazing, and I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. For my part of the panel, I'm going to talk about how much revenue each legalization state has made in adult use cannabis taxes, and also to discuss the regulatory costs and how they compare to revenues. In short, states are bringing in tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars every year in cannabis taxes and fees, and the regulatory costs pale in comparison to what's being brought in. And I'm going to bring up a chart right now to show you what states have brought in cannabis tax revenue. These are all of the legalization states that have at least one full year of legal sales, sorted from the oldest to the newest legal sales. We've got the tax rates there, how much total revenue they brought in 2020, and then I've adjusted them all for Delaware's population. Of course, Delaware's tax rate is 15% in the bill. It's very different. It's lower, I think, than every one of these states. So we wouldn't actually expect this amount of revenue, but it just gives you an idea since they have such different population sizes. So one thing we see is that the older the state is, the more the tax revenue is. In Colorado and Washington, the states brought in $362 and $616 million in the past year. And then we see much lower per capita revenue in the newer states. We also see higher tax revenue in the states that have higher taxes, but obviously that's a higher burden on consumers. So whereas Washington's program is a little bit newer than, they started sales 6 months after Colorado, they actually brought in more revenue per capita than Colorado did. And by the same token, Illinois brought in more revenue per capita than Michigan. In Delaware, the goal isn't to raise tax revenue. You know, that's one added benefit, but the goal is primarily to do away with all the harms that have been discussed and to build an economy and to displace the illicit market and instead have a well-regulated legal market. But even though it's not the goal, it will still bring in tens of millions of dollars in tax revenue. In Washington, the tax rate is actually so high and sales have been going for so long that they brought in more cannabis taxes than liquor taxes, than alcohol taxes total last year, even though far fewer people are cannabis consumers than alcohol consumers. Also of note, this doesn't include any of the tax revenue for localities. A lot of the localities also have significant tax revenue that they're bringing in. And we've seen, even in the states with pretty high taxes, interestingly, in time, the prices for cannabis tends to be far lower in the legal regulated market than the illicit market. So in both Colorado and Washington, the pre-tax per gram price about 5 years in was $4.20 or so a gram before taxes. And according to priceofweed.com, it's far higher in Delaware, where it's more like, I think it says $13 per gram for medium quality cannabis, according to priceofweed.com. So the fact that cannabis is legal and regulated as long as you have enough supply tends to bring down prices pretty substantially. Now, the next thing I wanted to point attention to is this chart, which shows per year adult use cannabis taxes in Colorado to show just how striking the growth is year after year. In the first year of legal sales, there was $46 million of revenue. In the most recent year, there was $362 million. There were some people that thought, a lot of experts thought that revenue might decrease if you had a tax at the point of sale as prices go down, but that has not been the case in Colorado and other states. We just keep seeing more and more revenue. The first few years, I think, a good amount of it was people were transitioning from the illicit market to the legal market. But that by and large, people within Colorado were buying legal Colorado specifically sold cannabis within a few years, according to reports. And so there's been reports that a lot of the people buying cannabis from dispensaries at the adult use counter are actually using cannabis for medical use, not for fun. So reports found that out of 1,000 surveyed customers, more than 60% used it for pain and more than 60% used it for sleep. And we've actually seen the most growth in cannabis use in the oldest population, people who are 65 and up. A lot of people that are having trouble with pain, trouble with sleeplessness are able to reduce their use of prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs that can have such devastating side effects that can do organ damage and have the risk of addiction in the case of prescription opiates, and are able to use cannabis instead. So of course that savings and that health cost is also something that indirectly results. If we look at all of the cannabis tax revenue that Colorado has brought in since the onset of legalization, it's $1.4 billion, while Washington has brought in $2.4 billion in cannabis taxes. And of course, these aren't just numbers. These are real investments in the community's health that have improved lives. Washington used $188 million of its revenue last year from cannabis on its basic health plan trust fund, which is for health insurance for residents who were otherwise uninsured. Colorado has used much of its funding for schools, and Illinois is devoting 25% of its revenue to reinvest in communities that are hardest hit by the war on drugs. Now, next, I wanted to talk briefly about the administrative costs of regulating cannabis. My colleague Olivia Noggle put together a report that you can check out that has all kinds of detailed information on how much states have spent on regulating cannabis and how much they brought in fees and taxes, and it shows each of the states' licensing fees as well. Not every state provided us with the regulatory costs, but a lot of them had it publicly available or responded to queries. So in short, at least 3 states, Alaska, Nevada, and Michigan, collected more in licensing fees than they spent to regulate cannabis. So separate from the tax revenue, they didn't even have to dip into the tax revenue at all for regulatory costs in those 3 states. In Alaska, which has the closest population to Delaware of all the legalization states, they only had to spend $1.8 million regulating cannabis in fiscal year 2019, whereas they brought in over $2 million in licensing in the same year. So they brought in a little bit more in licensing than they spent in that state, and the total cost wasn't that high. In that state, application fees are about $1,000. Initial licenses are between $1,000 and $5,000, depending on the licensing type, and renewals are more than $7,000. I will note that Alaska has a licensing process that essentially, if you're qualified, you get a license. There's no numerical cap, and that's something that's very hard to pass through legislatures, and it's not in HB 150, so it does cost more money if there's a limited number of licenses being issued, and if there has to be a scored system to decide who gets licensed. So the fees are a little bit higher in HB 150, which is probably necessary if we want to cover the costs with those fees. In a few other states, they haven't quite covered the costs of regulations. Colorado and Oregon's fees are a little bit less total than the licensing costs, but again, they pale in comparison to the hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue that those states are bringing in, and all of the details are again available at that report. So I will be sticking around for questions and answers, which will be at the end of the panel, and here is Zoe.
Thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate that great information and those great informative charts. And thank you so much for being a panelist tonight. We also appreciate all your help with organizing these forums, as well as all the work that you've done here in Delaware. I don't think a lot of people realize, but you were one of the driving forces along with several advocates here in Delaware for the medical cannabis program, as well as all your help with decriminalization and the years that you've worked here helping Delaware legalize cannabis for adults 21 and older. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
So lastly, we have industry expert Andrew Livingston. Andrew Livingston serves a unique role as an economist, business analyst, and general cannabis policy wonk in Vicente Cedarburg's Denver office. As Director of Economics and Research, he helps clients develop and expand their enterprise across cannabis markets nationally and internationally. Marijuana and hemp-focused businesses depend on Andrew's services to navigate regulatory intricacies influencing market dynamics and to create sophisticated revenue models and pro forma for investors and strategic decision-making. Andrew has spent his entire career studying cannabis markets and first worked alongside the Vicente Cedarburg team in 2012 during Colorado's historic Amendment 64 campaign, which first legalized marijuana for adults. In addition to appearing as a regular on Marijuana Today, the cannabis industry's top business and politics podcast, Andrew is often asked to speak at business and legal seminars around the country and internationally on the intersection of market dynamics and cannabis policy. Before starting his career in the cannabis market and policy analysis, Andrew focused his studies at Collegiate University on the economics of illicit drug markets and the harms they create for societies around the world. Andrew is also a partner at Vicente's Cedarburg Policy and Public Affairs Consulting Affiliate, VS Strategies. Please welcome Andrew Livingston.
Thank you so much, Zoe, and thank you to the Delaware Cannabis Policy Coalition and Delaware CAN and MPP and everyone for listening today. I'm really happy to talk about what is one of really the most exciting new things when it comes to cannabis legalization, which, after not only just the ability to possess, consume, have the right to, have cannabis on your persons, is to potentially even enter a cannabis industry job and be able to build a career off serving people in a regulated and legal environment for cannabis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the job creation potential, as well as dovetail a little bit more on the total market size potentially, and really what we're seeing in other states and what is potentially possible in Delaware. So Delaware is a relatively small state, just under 1 million people, and right now its medical cannabis program is similarly small. So we've got a dynamic where really we only currently have about 6 different dispensaries vertically integrated in the state of Delaware, and what we're seeing from this is definitely some jobs that are being produced, but not a huge amount. So a Leafly report which does some of these jobs projections estimated about 350 direct cannabis jobs. And in total, when added indirect and induced jobs, just under about 500 jobs in 2018 in the state of Delaware. Now, that's relatively, not a huge amount, still a good amount per licensee. These are relatively larger businesses given the fact that they have to, cultivate, manufacture, and dispense cannabis. But what we will see with legalization is a significant increase in that total cannabis jobs creation, and the total number of people that can not only consume cannabis but make a living in a regulated taxed environment from a cannabis job. And so first, let me get into a little bit about what I mean by direct cannabis jobs, indirect and induced cannabis jobs. So when we're doing economic modeling for jobs projection, economists break this down into 3 main categories. So direct job would be someone who is employed by a cannabis licensee to cultivate cannabis, to manufacture cannabis, extract it, or to sell it to consumers. An indirect job is someone like myself who doesn't directly work for a cannabis company, but works for either a law firm or maybe a marketing agency or maybe a security contractor and gets paid by a cannabis company in order to provide a service that's directly necessary for the operation of that cannabis business. And then third and final, induced jobs. And that's essentially so cannabis employees spend their money, right? A cannabis employee is going to go to a restaurant, and that restaurant, the money that they spend there is going to go into tips for employees and, create service jobs for people that serve that economy. And so what we're seeing here is, it's not only the cannabis businesses that are employing people and creating jobs, it's also how those cannabis businesses spend their money and the job creation ecosystem around that, as well as how those cannabis employees spend their money in that local economy. And there have been a number of different studies that have looked at really this economic generation engine. And there's a 2016 report that was put forward by MPG Consulting, which analyzed job creation in Colorado. And based upon this report in 2016, they showed essentially you put money into the cannabis economy, and it spins out even more money in that kind of direct, indirect, and induced job creation and spending cycle. So for every dollar spent on marijuana retail, there was $2.4 dollars created in economic impact. So, the money that someone spends buying a cannabis product really, creates more than just that, right? Because an individual spends their money, and then that cannabis business spends it on investments and also spends it on their employees and those wages. And, those other companies spend more money. So that money kind of circles around. It's known as the velocity of money in an economy. So retail, produced 2.4 times as dollars spent, and marijuana manufacturing or infused products and extraction at about 2.34%, and marijuana cultivation at about 2.13%. 2.13 times. So for every dollar that was spent on a cultivation facility for investment, you got $2.13 in economic impacts, and for the entire economy in Colorado. And now, part of why cannabis actually increases some of this spending even more than in other industries, the economic generation, it's more than general manufacturing, it's more than mining, it's more than normal retail trade. And that's in part because most of the supply chain, in fact, all of the supply chain from seed to sale occurs within the state itself. And this is going to be the case in Delaware too, right? Now, Adam was talking about the cultivation and really, Delaware pulls more than its weight when it comes to certain sort of agricultural products, and that's going to have to be the case for cannabis as well, right? The cannabis that is sold in Delaware is going to have to be grown and extracted, turned into products in Delaware. So what that means is that, when a cannabis retailer is buying products, they're buying those products from producers that are also employing people in the state of Delaware. So this is all really exciting. And this means this job generation is only going to expand as a number of factors expand, which is one, the number of licenses and the number of business opportunities that exist in the state. And as well, the total potential consumer spending. And, one of the real major benefits when it comes to consumer spending in a state like Delaware, and really many of the states along the Northeast, is not just, the dynamic of the people that live in Delaware, right? There are cannabis consumers in Delaware. I'll talk about some estimates of how many of those are, based both upon the same methodology that was used in the auditor's report, but it's also the individuals from outside the state, right? From Maryland or from Pennsylvania. Delaware is a small state, but it's very close to some very large states. And what we see across the East Coast and the Northeast is that people travel between states to buy certain products. That may be like, when people go to New Hampshire for lower liquor taxes from some of their state stores, or, when people cross between New York and New Jersey to buy different products that may be better priced or more available in certain places. And this is really, some of the benefits that we see of legalization from an economic perspective for consumers beyond just what is potentially possible from the residents itself. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw in the auditor's report. And thankfully, I utilized some of the same methodology for some reports that I have put together. And so, we can talk about, okay, what are some, as the auditor was saying, this is a conservative analysis, and based upon new data, there may be even more cannabis consumers than initially anticipated. So based upon the auditor's report, we had about 103,000 consumers, and that was based on some data for consumption frequency that came from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from their 2015/2016 report. But if we look at the most recent data here, which is from the 2018 to 2019 report, indicates that more individuals in Delaware are admitting to their cannabis use. Obviously there's a lot of people that are just, maybe a little shy to talk about what is still an unlawful product when, they're talking to survey takers. But, if we're looking at this from those adults 21 and over currently, based upon the newest data and population projections for 2021, there's over 110,000 cannabis consumers, past month cannabis consumers in the state of Delaware, representing a market that's probably about 67,000 pounds of cannabis. Now, that's quite a lot, but compared to other states, not really that much. And we're also just talking about residents. And as I mentioned, there's many other consumers when it comes to, people coming in from Pennsylvania or Maryland that will buy products in Delaware, as well as tourists that come and visit Delaware and decide to purchase cannabis while they're there. And if those 67,660 pounds were transitioned into a total retail value based on $300 an ounce, we'd have a market in Delaware worth over $324 million. So there's a lot of potential opportunity here, particularly when it comes to licensing new businesses, small businesses, which tend to employ more people per dollar gained, to create a robust and thriving economy in the state of Delaware. And let me do a little bit to describe what some of these jobs actually mean. So these jobs include all sorts of different levels. So from entry retail, bud tenders, to managers of that retail, to people that deal with inventory and inventory stocking and analytics in the company itself to determine what these cannabis products are selling, how best to efficiently allocate inventory, and ensure that products are on the shelves and we're not running out. So even in just a retail environment, you have everything from entry-level retail all the way up to top-level managers and people with finance backgrounds. In manufacturing, you got really some of the coolest chemist jobs of people who make unique sort of cannabis products and extracts and deal with complex manufacturing. And on the cultivation side, you have everything from entry-level plant trimmers and technicians, individuals who have an agricultural background and are using that to ensure that the cannabis products produced are safe, effective, and really of the highest quality, all the way up to people who are installing HVAC systems and plumbing and electricity and really just interesting sort of jobs that touch cannabis, because the cannabis industry from seed to sale touches so many different sectors of our economy, both from the direct employment and also, as I mentioned, from that indirect employment. So I'm really excited to see what is here in the future for the state of Delaware. I'm really excited to really help the Delaware cannabis movement grow and ensure that we're not only raising tens of millions of dollars for projects like after-school programs or which is done in Colorado, or school construction, or even in certain cases, it's like helping new cannabis businesses get up and running. Right, there are certain low-income communities that have been hard impacted by the war on drugs, and what we are seeing is that in states like Illinois, utilizing some of that cannabis tax money in no interest or low interest loans to ensure that those new cannabis entrepreneurs can get a leg up, because sometimes it's very hard to get normal bank loans, if impossible at all. And so what we'll see in Delaware is many new opportunities that come with legalization, new opportunities for consumers, but also new opportunities for those who are looking to pursue a career building this new cannabis industry.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking the time to be with us here tonight and for sharing all your knowledge and experience. We really appreciate you taking the time to help our efforts here in Delaware. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zoe.
And we want to thank all of our expert panelists again for being a part of our forum this evening and for sharing all of their expertise with our viewers. So We're going to move on to public questions now. We have asked public participants to pre-submit questions for our panelists, and we have received several already. If you've not pre-submitted a question so far, you can ask a question by dropping it in our Facebook Live comment section, and we'll definitely try to get to as many questions as we can tonight. So for our first question, we have actually a pre-submitted question. Opponents to legalization often dismiss the economic benefits of legalization and claim that all the revenue goes to deal with problems associated with legalization, including DUI, increased drug use, increased crime. So the question for our panelists tonight, are there costs associated with problems caused by legalization? And as a follow-up question, where does the money go when it's generated in the legal states? And I know, Karen, you've done quite extensive research on this. So if you could also further tell us about what the $4.50 ounce study means and what that is.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start and others might want to chime in after. So the only direct, to be honest, cost I can think of other than needing to actually put in place the regulatory process. It's a good idea usually to have some public education to let people know, start low, go slow, consuming edibles so people don't have unpleasant experiences, to have public education about DUI, and to spend, a modest amount of money on education and prevention. In my city, we were the first city in the county, West Hollywood, California, to open sales. And so we had a lot of traffic and people, needing traffic direction and parking direction. But the supposed costs of legalization that we've heard, the major societal impacts, just are not borne out by the data. It's based on cherry picking and misrepresentation by and large. The biggest attempt I've seen to actually put numbers on it was this supposed study from a group called Centennial University. And they claim that for every dollar in tax revenue raised, you would have $4.50 an ounce, specifically in Colorado. So since they made such specific allegations, this research, I'm using that term very loosely, was reviewed by other people, and basically it was not true. So the biggest supposed cost they had was people who were teens using more marijuana, dropping out of school, and all of the economic costs was the bulk of it. In reality, in Colorado, there is a lower rate of teen use, very slightly lower, but lower now than there was pre-legalization. And college, dropouts was the other claim. The dropout rate is lower, again, than it was pre-legalization, and the graduation rate is higher. So all of these specific claims that were made that would lead to money were just bogus. An actual, research institute, the Illinois Economic Policy Institute, reviewed all of the research and found that they urged Illinois lawmakers to reject those dubious claims because the report suffered from poor policy analysis, and said because the authors fail to attempt to isolate the impact, no peer-reviewed academic journal would consider the findings credible. And we've seen the same kind of thing with some of these other claims. They'll have one thing pointed to, claiming that fatalities are up. If you look at all of the legalization states with before and after data, about half of them have slightly higher road fatalities, about half have slightly lower road fatalities. Obviously, there are a ton of things that go into the cause for road fatalities, but as a whole, the picture is there's not an increase. With crime rates as a whole, the picture is there's not an increase. With teen use as a whole, the picture is there's not an increase. And we have tons of data on our website that looks at before and after for each of these states, for each of these things. And there have been, analysis is done that have refuted them too. So in short, no, that's not borne out by the data.
Do any of our other panelists want to weigh in on that question?
I just briefly, I think those studies, I've seen them as well. A lot of them, they play on old propaganda and stereotypes, attributing value to things like, the cost of people becoming more obese because they're cannabis consumers to the tune of millions of dollars. So, those studies are playing on old propaganda, where you have other studies that are showing that cannabis consumers are more active than the average person. So, they're really playing on propaganda. And then a lot of them, they fall into that same category of most prohibitionist arguments, where they consider like the premise that we live in this world where no one consumes cannabis and people only start consuming cannabis after it's legalized, which we know is false. So those studies are all based on false premises right from the start.
Great. So our next question, one of the things that we hear a lot from opponents and other concerned people is the problem with banking. So if our panelists could discuss what is going on with banking across the nation.
Sure thing. Yeah. So right now we have generally, many cannabis businesses have access to banks, but it's unstable banking. So back in 2014, the Treasury Department put forward a memo, and this is very, it was similar to the Cole memo that came out, earlier in 2013, but this was known as the FinCEN memo. And FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and that's the government agency. It's a subdepartment of the Department of Treasury that regulates the Bank Secrecy Act. So this is, dealing with bank regulation, ensuring that banks aren't laundering money for illegal enterprises. And what this basically put forward was guidance, basically saying we understand, cannabis at the federal level is illegal. Banks are federally regulated, but you can work with a cannabis business as long as you are doing your due diligence. So that's the due diligence, or the know your customer's customer is a really important aspect of kind of this cannabis banking regulation, or not necessarily regulation, but oversight and guidance. And it required them to do a number of different sorts of due diligence tasks when it came to verifying licensure, verifying the accuracy of their records, verifying the fact that they weren't committing certain sorts of compliance violations or selling to minors. And this is where it's hard for these banks to do, particularly when you're representing lots of different cannabis companies. And so right now, cannabis businesses are predominantly banked by smaller credit unions or smaller local community banks. And those sorts of banks serve these cannabis businesses, but in certain states, they can't take any more new clients. And so it's difficult for a cannabis business to find a bank. And sometimes, a cannabis bank will just decide to drop accounts. And that also makes it hard to find a new banking relationship. So that on the commercial banking is one major component. Another factor is that cannabis businesses can't get standard bank loans because even the banks that do work with cannabis accounts typically don't provide lending services, as that's kind of another risk profile. And then even beyond that, there comes to the payment processing and the merchant processing dynamic, which is why you have to use cash to buy cannabis in certain dispensaries across the country. And that's because Visa, MasterCard, these other sorts of major national and international payment processors are unwilling to service cannabis businesses and cannabis accounts there. And so everything is really done in cash for those purposes.
Thank you so much. So what is 280E and what does it mean for revenue and taxes?
I can take up this one unless Adam or Karen want to jump in first. And so 280E is a provision of the tax code that prevents writing off of standard business deductions. So, I'm not a CPA, but this is kind of the basis of what it is. And so, cost of goods sold, which, if you are a business, is the cost of producing the cannabis, extracting the cannabis, creating the specific products itself, or in the case of a retailer, the cost wholesale of buying those cannabis products that they are then selling. Those are able to be deducted because of how the income, how the definition of income works. But the cost of actually selling that cannabis, whether that's retail employees or marketing or some of the dispensary, essentially many of the costs of operations for a dispensary are not deductible. So what that means is that when determining their federal tax burden, it's not based on their net profits. It's based on those gross profits. So just revenue minus cost of goods sold. This increases taxes significantly for cannabis businesses, particularly for retailers, which just leads to lower investment. It's like you can't give cannabis retailers as big of a bonus, or you can't hire more people because you're spending that money on taxes when really it's not even money that they made. It's money that they spent on further investments that were necessary in order to sell the cannabis they purchased. And so this is a real issue, particularly for new and young upstart cannabis businesses. It can result in a situation in which they didn't actually make any money. They're still losing money as they're growing, but because they have positive gross revenues, they have to pay taxes on that, even though when accounting for their sales, general, and administrative costs, they didn't make any money. So this is another significant problem for cannabis businesses that has to do with the fact that cannabis is illegal at the federal level. And there's a provision of the tax code that prohibits Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, or those that deal and traffic in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, which, as many of you know, marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, from deducting those sorts of standard provisions. Furthermore, something that most people don't know is that it's not just those deductions for selling general and administrative expenses, but it's also other specific deductions. So certain, environmental credits or things like that, like putting in solar panels or certain investments, you actually also can't receive because of 280E, those certain federal credits as well.
Thank you so much. I think that really helps answer a lot of questions that people are having here in Delaware. So actually, next week, one of our largest opponents to cannabis legalization, the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, is actually holding a legalization roundtable on the economic impact. And one of the big misinformation that they put out is that there's anticipated additional cost to employers due to legalization. Could any of our panelists discuss that?
Sure, I'll chime in first. So the only thing I've seen that has been a specific number that's changed for employers after legalization is in the numbers I looked at were Colorado, because it's the oldest state for legal sales. So I haven't looked at them in other states, but it's called loss costs. It's how much employers essentially pay into workers' comp, which is based on the number and severity of injuries that have been suffered by workers. And those loss costs, what employers have to pay towards workers' comp insurance, have gone down significantly since legalization in Colorado. So the only concrete number I've seen is actually a significant decrease in workers' comp costs in Colorado. I'm not aware of any increases that employers have had.
Thank you so much. This is actually kind of like a two-part question. The first part was actually submitted by Russell from Newcastle County. And then there was a subsequent question that was submitted that asks, how will cannabis legalization laws be used to empower and encourage minority ownership of small businesses? And how does legalization help communities of color build generational wealth?
Sure. So I could talk about that a little bit. So this really depends predominantly on how the laws are structured, both when it comes to licensing, but in addition to that, when it comes to the disbursement of tax money. So first and foremost, let's talk about licensing. So many new states are reserving certain license types, whether or not those are, essentially lower barrier to entry, lower cost licenses like delivery or hospitality licenses to what they define as social equity businesses for a certain number of years. So I just saw this in Denver, and delivery licenses are reserved for social equity applicants, I think until 2024 in their newest proposal, and hospitality or social consumption is reserved until 2027. And Massachusetts also has done this for delivery licenses. So this is a way of ensuring that those who have been most impacted by the war on drugs get the first bite of the apple when it comes to license types that may only require a few $100,000 or $1 million to start out, when a cultivation facility can often cost tens of millions. So this is one portion from the licensing side. There's also a dynamic in which sometimes when you have a competitive application process, or with a limited number of licenses, you can provide certain points on winning that license in that competitive application for meeting certain equity goals, whether that comes to serving low-income communities through employment, or with really the primary emphasis is on ownership. So ensuring that these businesses have a certain percentage of their ownership of individuals who have been hurt by the war on drugs. So that's when it comes from the licensing and ownership sides of it. And really on the other side, it comes to, okay, how do you spend your money? So there's a few different ways that it can be done to benefit low-income communities and those communities most harmed by the war on drugs. And the first and foremost part is providing money in sort of funds to serve those upstart cannabis entrepreneurs, as I mentioned previously, to start their cannabis business. So starting a cannabis business is expensive. You typically can't get standard bank loans, and oftentimes cannabis operators currently get it from friends and families and other high net worth investors. But those individuals from communities most harmed by the war on drugs typically don't have that same sort of very wealthy connection. And so, utilizing low interest loans or no interest loans from the state itself, from tax money, can be a really added benefit to starting up and being successful in your cannabis business. Another way to do it is to just directly provide money in the form of grants to these low-income communities for a variety of different services. And I always say, it is absolutely important that we have a cannabis business that is diverse and represents the diverse community. But there are a lot of people that have been harmed by the war on drugs that don't necessarily want to start a cannabis business. They might want to start, a restaurant, or an electrician service provider, or maybe they want to work in the cannabis industry but as an ancillary provider, doing HVAC, or creating the new unique sort of most efficient pots or irrigation services. And those people should be able to access loans as well from these cannabis taxes. And so I think if we build up enough revenue from cannabis taxes and disperse it to those individuals most harmed by the war on drugs, we can not only help people start new businesses directly within the cannabis industry, but also those in the surrounding community for just the betterment of all of those who live in Delaware.
Okay, thank you so much. So our next question is, how can cannabis legalization help with COVID recovery?
Adam or Karen, would you want to jump on this first? I know I just answered the last question.
So we need jobs. A lot of people are out of work, obviously, and cannabis creates a lot of jobs. In Colorado, there are more than 40,000 people have badges to work in the cannabis industry. They're good for about 2 years, so it doesn't mean that they all, have current badges, but it gives you some idea of just how many people are employed in the industry, and that doesn't count all of the non-plant touching jobs. So just by legalizing a new industry, you'll create a lot of new jobs. Also, I know where I live, there are a lot of stores that are going out of business and a lot of other businesses that are shutting down. So it can revitalize communities by having new businesses where that's desperately needed. And also just bringing in state taxes. I'm not sure exactly how the budget in Delaware is, but some states are considering having to lay people off. Some localities are. Bringing in more tax revenue can both preserve jobs if there would otherwise have to be cuts, and it just creates the whole multiplier effect that stimulates the economy by having this new legal business.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of capturing that legal revenue. I think Andrew mentioned an estimate of over $300 million industry. In a small state like Delaware, that's like a 0.5% of our GDP. And if you have a multiplier of economic impact of over 2, you're talking about a whole percentage of our GDP. So if you're looking for economic growth, why not start, actually capturing that growth legally.
Yeah, I would also say that a huge amount of the investment in the cannabis industry comes early on, right? So if we were to legalize, this year, we're going to see a huge amount of investment in 2021 and 2022 when it comes to building out these new facilities, and a lot of that comes from other ancillary jobs that may have didn't have the same amount of income and same amount of revenue and demand in 2020 during the pandemic. So, when it comes to construction services, we may not have been building the same number of houses because, we were worried about a recession, or, the same number of commercial buildings, or, let's even say like, someone who services commercial office buildings for cleaning services or for lighting or, HVAC in a commercial office, right? Those people aren't working as much as they used to because everyone's working from home. And so putting in a cannabis industry requires a lot of investment up front from those sorts of ancillary industries that serve, what's known as the capital expenditures. And with that, I think you'll see a lot of that investment up front, which will really help to, trigger more investment, more jobs in the state of Delaware.
Thank you so much. So kind of to touch on the ancillary jobs that are going to be created, we have a question from Mark Jacobs from Sussex County. The economic benefit from legalization includes many ancillary services and industries, among them security, HVAC technicians, facility maintenance, accountants. How are these needed but indirect services accounted for in the economic impact? And what ancillary fields benefit from legalization?
Yeah, so I think I addressed some of this on the portion when I was speaking earlier on the panel, but I'll reiterate it again. It's really interesting. So the way that economic impact models work, direct, indirect, and induced job creation. So when it comes to direct employees, that's how a cannabis business pays its employees. It makes money and it hires growers, it hires trimmers, it hires extractors and product creators and retailers and inventory management specialists. And all of those people on the direct payroll of the cannabis business count as those direct employees. That's what Karen was mentioned, badged employees in the state of Colorado. Those are people that need a badge. And then there is, a cannabis business, spends money in addition to just employees on individuals who might not have a badge. So I personally don't have, a badge in the state of Colorado anymore. And so, I'm not in a cannabis business all the time, but I'm still essentially indirectly paid by a cannabis business to provide them consulting services, allow them to, understand what new markets may look like. And my job as well is directly created because cannabis consumers are spending their money at legal and regulated businesses. And then beyond that, there's, the individuals who work for a cannabis business and how they spend their money. So that might not even be someone who directly serves a cannabis business, but they essentially directly serve cannabis business employees. So, when the manager of a cannabis, store goes out to an Italian restaurant with their wife, they spend money and the money that's in their server's pocket at the end of the night essentially came from cannabis spending, even though it indirectly flowed through that economy. So because cannabis is really a dynamic plant that is from seed to sale and agricultural, manufactured, extracted, scientifically produced, and then sold in a retail packaged environment, and eventually, depending on the state, in a kind of a more social use hospitality environment, there is very few jobs along the supply chain that aren't either directly or indirectly touched by the cannabis industry.
Thank you so much. So with the jobs question, one of the questions that we received, do the direct industry jobs pay well?
Yes. Yeah, so they tend to pay above average, which is really cool. There's some good studies out there from a cannabis hiring firm known as Vankst. And I can pull these up in a second. Wasn't sure this question was coming. But, they typically pay, depending on what role you're at, about 20, 30% above average for that specific job sector. But if we jump over to another question, I'll open this up and be able to provide some of those average salaries for these sorts of cannabis business employees.
Well, in Colorado, I think it's causing some issues with servers and availability of servers because they find they can make more money trimming bud than they could at restaurants. And I think you guys out there had a shortage of of servers there for a period, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, that was also because there was back in 2018, 2019, with an explosion in the population, there were just so many different new restaurants. So, I think that may have also, in addition to being cannabis employees, probably had something to do with the fact that there were new cool restaurants popping up everywhere across the city. And so, it's one of those sorts of dynamics here. 1 second.
So this next question asks to explore some of the financial incentives for some of the opponents of cannabis legalization to maintain cannabis prohibition. I know, Adam, you and I have had a lot of conversations on that particular aspect. If you have any comments to weigh in on that.
Well, that's because my perspective on that, I think, comes from my profession on in the criminal justice world. A lot of these opponents, when you consider their arguments against legalization, if you consider they're using a cost-benefit analysis too, they're just applying microeconomic theory instead of macroeconomic theory. They're looking at their own financial best interest. Law enforcement gets funding for it. Their clearance rates for cannabis offenses are significantly higher than any other cases. It's easy work for them. So I think that they're willing to sacrifice people's freedom and people's right to not have their cars and house searched and keep the status quo as it is, because it financially benefits them. We see that with many of the opponents of legalization, that you can, if you dig deep enough, there's some financial self-interest or something that's in their interest that they weigh more heavily than the interest of society as a whole.
Okay, so next I think we'll go to the Facebook comments. So the first question comes from Michael. In your opinion, what is the more profitable sector, the growing of cannabis or the retail sales end?
So this often depends upon the licensing dynamics of the cannabis program that you're in, state by state. In many states, there are fewer cannabis cultivators with the number of licenses than there are retailers. So in that regard, there's essentially the cultivators are able to exert more kind of what's intersector power within the market. So, they end up with the larger market, the larger margin, wholesale margin along that supply chain. This is flipped in a state like Nevada, where there's many more cultivators than there are, retail stores in Las Vegas. And with those high retail prices, they're also, some of those stores are able to essentially take a larger margin of what they earn along that supply chain. But even beyond that, when you factor in 280E, because retailers have a larger percentage of their total budget is in selling general and administrative expenses than it is in cost of goods sold, they tend to have a higher tax burden as a percentage of their total revenue. So those are some of the dynamics there. And let me, I pulled up some of these salaries. And so if we're looking at, this is from the 2019 Vank's salary guide. So, if we're looking at bud tenders, they're making at the top level about $18 an hour, mid-level about $15 an hour. So it's already essentially at what people are aspiring to for minimum wage. And those are the lowest level employees. Once you get to general managers, you're making, upwards of $90,000 and on average about $56,000. And when you get to the director of retail level, at the highest level, they're making about $125,000 a year, with generally directors of retailing making about $98,000 a year. And so it's significantly higher than it is, for a director of retail of let's just say, a head shop or something like that. And for manufacturing, some of the coolest things here are, product technicians or edible specialists. At the high level, product technicians, are making $26 an hour. Product supervisors at the high levels could be making $77,000 a year. So, there's some significant revenues that are significant salaries that are being made by these employees. And this is because, cannabis businesses need to find good employees who are willing to, willing to work there. And it's a fast-paced, difficult environment. And so in order to ensure, that employees stay around and are well appreciated, they tend to be paid well.
Okay. So next we have a question from Ken Walski, actually, who's been a part of our panels in the past, as well as a leading force in New Jersey's legalization measures. And his question is, my understanding is that there is a required supermajority in the Delaware legislature when passing bills that include imposing a tax. Given all the human benefits and cost savings of legalizing cannabis, why not introduce or modify a current bill to legalize marijuana without imposing a state tax on the product? This would only require a simple majority in the legislature to pass, or at least to the governor's desk.
I think the short answer is we tried that. We did. We put together two separate bills, one to legalize and one to tax, and we submitted it, and they didn't go that direction.
I'll note, I think the requirement includes fees too. So you couldn't have a licensing system. You couldn't have any kind of license sales at all without needing a supermajority. And it doesn't seem like the support's there for it at this time.
Yes, that's correct. And as well as what Adam said, definitely correct. It's a strategy that we definitely proposed to the prime sponsors that was not met with a lot of support from either the prime sponsors or any other legislator that we talked to about doing it in that regard. Obviously, our motivation, would make sure that taxes are kept low and inevitably lowered over time. But definitely, something that we're working towards. So Crystal Hamilton asks, are there any incentives for veterans?
So in certain states, for when they have limited license systems and competitive applications, they provide those sorts of benefits to not just those who are either owned by, individuals most impacted by the war on drugs, meet those social equity requirements, but often also other women-owned businesses and veteran-owned businesses. And in certain states as well, they ask companies about, who their vendors are to ensure that, they're not only owned potentially by veterans, but also that they are hiring veterans as part of, a company to build their cultivation facility or, provide other goods and services for the cannabis business itself.
Thank you so much. And like I said, we're actually going to be holding an information session on HB 150 next week that goes over the many details and the components that are included within that piece of legislation. So we'll address some of these questions, especially that question and a few others on that forum next week. So we're almost out of time for tonight. I just want to thank everyone who tuned in and joined us for tonight's forum. And a big thank you to our special guest speaker, Delaware State Auditor Kathy McGuiness, and our expert panelists, Karen O'Keefe, Andrew Livingston, and Adam Windett. We're so very grateful for you all taking the time to share all your experience and knowledge with our audience. And thank you so much for your help with our work here in Delaware and across the country. I also want to thank the Marijuana Policy Project for lending us their fabulous StreamYard platform for tonight's presentation, which allows us to bring you tonight's program with a higher production value than our previous forums. And a special thank you to Karen O'Keefe, who played a dual role tonight, also being our behind-the-scenes producer for tonight's event. We're really encouraging everyone to please take action to end the harmful and costly failed policy of cannabis prohibition by contacting your state representative and state senator to ask them to vote yes on HB 150, which was just introduced earlier today. We don't have voter initiative or referendum here in Delaware like our neighbors in New Jersey. So engaging our elected officials is literally the only way to change the law here in Delaware. As mentioned, we'll be hosting HB 150 info session next week. Look for our website, emails, and social media accounts to find out when that event will be scheduled. We'll also be scheduling additional public forums. And we also have a series of outreach activities planned for the next 16 weeks. And we really need help. So we're looking for volunteers to help with our citizen-led efforts to pass this common sense measure. You can get involved by contacting our volunteer coordinator at volunteer@delawarecannabis.org. If you haven't already, please sign up for our action emails at delawarecannabis.org. You can also find more information about cannabis legalization, how to contact your elected officials, and how to get involved with our all-volunteer movement on our website. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. Have a great night.